since Richard didn't make it, I'll give you some of his notes. He noted that Scrum wasn't designed for situations like his, where he has one team working with a lot of clients. And he comes back to the idea of having the right people on your team. So it's interesting because I wanted to flash this up here. You guys can read this and see, these are Richard's exact words. This is an exact quote. Some of the things that he wanted to talk about. But I have a few comments about this. One is something that I agree with, that there's what he calls linear elements, which are the big chunks. You're never doing everything in 2-week increments. You're just not. Some things are one day, and some things are big chunks that you really have to plan ahead and think about. And you need space in your process for that. So that's something I completely agree with, and it's one of the things we're trying to get to. There's one thing that I actually would go a different way on, which is I think that Agile people really obsess on that face-to-face, hand-to-hand communication and building teams with good relationships. I actually think you don't need that at all. Look at an open source team. People have no personal relationship. They just exchange code. And it works great if you're used to that. So I think the face-to-face stuff and the team dynamics is a luxury. What's not a luxury is working with really good people. Good people do good work. And by opening this up as a global process, it maybe increases the odds that you're going to have the right people on your team. So in preparation for this, I went out with my colleague, John Friedman. Where's John? John Friedman went and interviewed a whole bunch of people who manage Agile projects, some very large Agile projects. And what he came back with was a finding that there's actually 3 different use cases for Agile software development. We learn Agile software development in almost a monoculture. 10 out of 12 of the companies that we talked to were doing Scrum. So there's a very narrow range of Agile practices. But actually, there's a pretty wide range of users that have different needs. If you're a major release developer, if you build software that's released every 3 to 6 months, it's enterprise software, or I've actually been running into a lot of people who make cars or tractors, embedded software. It takes even longer. It takes 5 years to make a car. If you do that, then the whole Scrum team building, team management, team motivation thing is going to be appealing to you, because when we talk to those people, that's what they care about. Team bonding, maximizing team efficiency, and tracking the progress of those teams over time. But if you're fresh-tilled soil, oh, and I should mention that Richard Banfield, my co-presenter from Fresh-Tilled Soil, is not going to be able to make it tonight because he has the flu. And so Mark is going to stand in for him. We'll see Mark a little bit later talking about his philosophy of how to do continuous improvement with some of these cloud projects. But if you're fresh-tilled soil, you have a lot of clients and you have one team servicing those clients. So you have this funnel where you couldn't, for instance, do a Scrum for every client. You'd do 10 of them a day and then you wouldn't do any work. And what you really care about is resource allocation. Is there someone available to meet that need? And you also care about things like bringing on new contributors. Exactly. So your boundaries are a little different that way. If you're building online applications, it turns out you're talking a completely different language. Isn't that right, John? We have to worry about continuous integration and DevOps. Not talking about team bonding at all. It's a totally different set of technology concerns. You're trying to get releases out frequently. You're trying to automate that. And that's really the area that we live in. We have a lot of issues that are common to cloud developers at Assembla. So putting up our needs against Scrum, 10 out of the 12 people we talk to in big, small, medium Agile projects, we're using Scrum. I was just at GE's Agile conference. They're training thousands of people just to do Scrum. It's sort of a monoculture out there. But if you're doing cloud app development, you have distributed teams. We have 40 people in 15 countries at Assembla working on our product every day. You're talking about multiple teams or sort of expanding teams. Scrum is 5 to 10 people, and frequent releases. So we release a couple times every day now. That's not really a Scrum cycle. Other companies out in the dreaded Silicon Valley have experienced this, and they do things that are not Scrum. Facebook is releasing twice a day. And we took some inspiration when we started studying the issues from Google's Android project, where they essentially look at it as a code management project, where they're bringing together code from thousands of contributors. And even the guys at Google told me they have 3,000 contributors at Qualcomm. So, you know, that's not a Scrum team. It's a different kind of animal. So we started looking at, well, what goes beyond Scrum? You know, if so many of the people that we talked to are here. And the first thing that we noticed is we call it Scrum Bond. This is what we ended up doing with a distributed team. I'll talk about it. And then finally, sort of second, continuous delivery, which is where you design your process so that you're not releasing every 2 weeks or month or 6 months. You're actually doing it every day. And it sounded like an impossible task when I first encountered it, when somebody said, oh, you should do this Kanban thing. And what we've learned, and I've been working through it with Michael Kletzos here, what we've learned is that there are very specific things, a small number of things you can do, and it will work. And finally, once you get that done, you can start to bring in people from all over the world. You can just start to feed them into the process like a stream of water and scale up. So the first I'm going to talk about the Scrum Bond step, which is, I'll use this cumulative flow diagram idea. So we pull out a certain number of tasks into a sprint backlog, it's called. This is the typical sprint Scrum sprint. And then we burn up, we do that work until we're done. Has anybody ever run a Scrum sprint that looks exactly like this? That would be awesome. The alternative that's often proposed is Kanban. It's not iterative at all. The idea is that you have a small number of tasks that you're working on and everything else you just ignore. So you pull off the number of tasks you can work on today, and as you finish them, you pull off the next task, and you just constantly go that way, which is great, except if you have to test and release your product iteratively. So I think if you have a distributed team, you're very likely to fall into this pattern. I know that we did. And this is sort of like Scrum because you're releasing an iteration, but it's sort of like Kanban because you're just going to pull off, you're not going to do any iteration planning. So the miracle here that's great for distributed teams is you don't have to get everybody in a room to agree what you're going to do. You just pull off the work that you can work on today. You do it until finally you get to a point where you say, hey, I have to do a release. You throw out all the stuff that's not going to make the release. I'm calling that triage here. You feature freeze, and then you stabilize until you can release. And actually, a lot of people do this. This is a picture of a release that Constant Contact did. That ideal, actual. So you actually come much close to the ideal if you do this Scrum Bond process. And it's simple. You just skip the iteration plan. Any Scrum team can do it. So that makes it a little more suitable for distributed teams. What I'm going to talk about next is how you turn that into continuous delivery. So how do you get to this point where, Facebook, they're releasing twice a day code from 600 developers, or even if you have 2 guys, and Paul Graham used to say, I edit the code. I remember he used to say that, right? I edit the code while the customer's on the phone. Well, this is what you don't do, but most software teams do this, right? This is how they test for release. They merge everything together, they have a release candidate, and then they test it. And if it's good, they release it, and if it's not, they keep cycling that. So how many people test this way? Pretty much the way to do it. The only problem with that is you can't do continuous delivery, because whenever you merge this stuff together, you're going to find some problems. If you want to do continuous delivery, there's sort of a necessary and sufficient condition, which is you have to have multiple test systems. So each contributor that's going to send something through to your release version will have their own on-demand test system. This is the magic of cloud computing. And you'll be able to run continuous integration, which is automated tests on those on-demand systems. You'll be able to call your QA team over, essentially as a consultant, to help the developer decide whether that's ready. And when all of those things line up, you send it through, and you can release it. And you don't have to worry about the next guy. He's going to grab that production revision and test his change separately. So it's a little bit complicated to set up because you have a lot more machinery, but conceptually, this is going to get you to continuous delivery if you do this. there's a little more machinery that we add at Assembla. For instance, we have this concept of a merge request. It's like a Garrett change or a GitHub pull request. It's a code review step where you say, okay, I have a bunch of changes, I'm going to review them, and then I'm going to merge them. And you can actually set up your continuous integration system. We're using Jenkins to look at that merge request and test it before it goes through to the rest of the testing and vote on it. Yes, it's good. No, it's not good. You can also set up other kinds of Jenkins things to do things like deploy out to these on-demand test instances and really use the magic of cloud computing that's making this possible. This is a little bit different cumulative flow diagram. This is Assembla's cumulative flow diagram from the last month. Nothing happening here. Well, there actually is something happening. You can see we lost control of our work in progress. It got bigger, and we were just arguing about that today. But in terms of the velocity here, it's very, very predictable. So you don't really have to worry about your releases. It lowers your stress a lot. Putting it all together, this is the process we're recommending essentially as a replacement for that little Scrum loop, which is very similar to the existing Agile process. If you use an Agile process, you have a prioritized backlog. All Agile processes start that way, that your product owner builds. You're going to pull off a certain amount into your current work bin, your Kanban board, or your sprint backlog. And from there, we're recommending that you run a version of a Kanban where people pull one task at a time. We call these guys contributors. And then they test on their on-demand test environments. They do that continuous integration, QA consultation. And at the end, when you get ready to release, you pull what's ready into your release. So it's very simple what we've done here. We've moved the iteration plan from the beginning. It's gone. That was a big, difficult task that we don't want to have to do. And we do it at the end. We just take what's ready at the end. And we can do that as frequently as we like. The other thing that we're trying to do with the scalable Agile process that makes it scalable Agile as opposed to just continuous delivery is include lots of different kinds of contributors. So Scrum is great, but you have to train these Scrum teams, and that's the dreaded process change. Nobody likes having their work screwed with that way. You might want to include individuals that don't fit those teams. You might want to include outsourcers, industrial partners, as we were talking about with Google and Android. And you certainly want to be able to include Scrum teams without any process change. So this is Scrum compatible, because your Scrum team can grab their sprint backlog out of this bin, do the same thing they always do. So that's our proposal for how to release continuously and scale. And there's a couple advantages. It's faster. You can do different durations of tasks, short and long. It's good for distributed teams because you've got rid of those big meetings like the iteration planning and the release planning. And it scales to more contributors, which was the whole reason to handle the distributed teams. Any questions about that?
I'm sorry, what is the iterative thing? I don't know what that means.
Processes like Scrum are called iterative processes because they release on a specific schedule. So it used to be that people would build software until they met all their requirements, yes, and then they would release it. And that took an unknown amount of time. It was very risky. Now most people use an Agile process. So the core of Agile is the idea that you release frequently, and if possible on a specific time period, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months, and you release what's ready at that time. You really work hard to make sure that you can get a release. And so that's called iterative development, and it's pretty much synonymous with Agile.
So if you throw it away, what happens?
You release even more frequently, okay, which makes it even more agile. So that's the continuous delivery keyword that people are using out in California.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Could you please go back to slide? I have a question about merge requests. So how do you define them? How big are they? Because if they are too big, then you cannot test them effectively because the test system is,
Michael, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. I'll stand up. So basically, you try to keep the merge request as small as possible.
how small?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. I mean, quite frankly, if it's a bug, that's it. That merge request only has that bug in it. If you're working in a ticket-based system, it should be one ticket really to a merge request. It's as small as possible that makes sense for that unit. And in the continuous delivery model, you would, or scalable Agile, you would immediately push that to production. If you go back to the continuous delivery only because it has a little bit more. Yeah, that one. So ideally here, once you've done this merge request, this is to a test system. When the merge request is applied to this, this is what production would look like when you push it out to production.
Yeah, there's a missing arrow here, which is you're going to copy production here, and then you're going to apply your one change. But the answer is that you make the changes as small as possible, but they have very different natural sizes. If you're releasing a big feature, it's going to be a big chunk. And there's some little tricks that we didn't talk about, like you're going to copy production here. There's another trick, which is most of the people that do this have a flag so that they can release all the code, but they can turn it off and on. They just leave it turned off until they're ready to turn it on. So it's all in there before you turn it on and show it to anybody. And in fact, most people do dog fooding where they turn it on just for their own use. We do that in Assembla. There's a lot of features we're using now, all these scalable, agile, multi-team features that we might talk about later that nobody else has yet.
Sure, and in continuous delivery, I mean, there's a couple things you just have to change your mindset on. One is the notion of feature flags that you was just talking about. So even if you have a large feature to push out, you're pushing out small changes all the time. And maybe you're using it internally if it can be. If it can't be, it's just not being seen to anybody. And then when you're ready to release it or use it, you turn it on, the feature. The other thing is QA is no longer it's not stopping things going to production, but it's guarding production in that they test production and they use production, and you have to have real-time metrics on your production to understand what's happening once you've made these small changes to see if it's affecting, let's be honest, our revenue, because that's all we all care about. So you have to change some of the ways you work in order to be able to constantly push out this code. But why do you want to push out this code so fast? It's because what typically happens in a scrum-based or iterative approach is, they can be long iterations, or they can be short, doesn't matter, but 2 weeks, let's say, because that's a common one for a short one. So developers developed it at the beginning, and then at the end of 2 weeks, your QA has said this is broken. So now that developer has to go back 2 weeks and remember what they did 2 weeks ago. That takes some time, that takes some change in their thought process.
Yeah, and there's a lot of life simplification that comes from only having tasks in your task list that you're working on now. And a lot of it's working memory in your head and other kinds of resources.
So by pushing out the small changes right away and seeing the actual results from them, you get immediate feedback for the developer.
That's why these techniques are often called lean. They try to eliminate inventory, which is the unfinished tasks. That's the definition of lean process.
And developers typically like this because they're not being reminded of something 6 months ago, which is such me.
The test, if you could stop maybe on the slide with the continuous integration.
Yeah.
The test system 1, test system 2. I assume that's the same test system.
No, you have to have multiple so that developers can create these test systems ad hoc whenever they want.
No, I mean, the code is the same.
Yes, yes. The code should always be master, let's call it, your master code base, which is what production is. Master should always be releasable. That's the idea. So you're pulling master back to the test system. If you're using Git, you're going to rebase or merge backwards, whatever you do, depends on your process. And then you're applying your new change set on top of that, testing that, which then once you accept that, that becomes your master, and master is immediately pushed to production.
So the test system, what is it? Is it the automated one or the?
Well, it's both automated with continuous integration, and if you want to do QA, or if you want somebody else to look at it, say you have product managers that have to okay it, or you have a customer that needs to okay it, say you're a bank that needs to go through these rigorous quality assurance things, then they can look at this test.
Yeah, so there's the traditional continuous integration, which is just an invisible build and test, run automated tests. There's also a deployment to a staging environment of some sort.
It's both.
Yes.
Yeah, you want to do both, because you're going to do both kinds of testing.
It's flexible also to what you need to do there.
But it is a challenge to create these on-demand test systems. And especially if you're doing embedded or something, you have to sort of create them where every place where everybody's working. But that's what you do. That's the work you do.
And if you are a bank who needs to have, I always go to banks because they can't release anything to production until they go through these rigorous process, or quality assurance, I hate that word, anyway. It's the quality management process. You can have that before your master production. So you just have a place where everyone integrates down into. But this is still a continuous release or continuous delivery into that quality management system before it goes to production.
Yeah,
so
and
that you treat as your production.
And I skipped a piece here. I have a slide that I got from our partners at Serena called the Continuous Delivery Dial. And basically what they point out is you can run this continuous delivery process in your development team because it clears away a lot of headspace and resources. But you can stop at a certain point and you put it into a batch process like user acceptance testing or regulatory compliance or localization. And they have this idea of a continuous delivery dial where you decide where to stop and drop it into the batch process. And one point I like to make is that there are companies like Yahoo that actually take the dial to 11. They put the code into production and they test it, and if it works, then they merge it back into their master or trunk or mainline version. So that's 11. Yeah.
And I like that.
So you have a lot of choices. Yeah.
Well, isn't production always the best test environment?
I do.
We're all using it whether we admit it or not.
All right, so I've used my 20 minutes. I'm gonna try to cruise fast. This is a picture of from Salesforce.com. It's kind of old, but we got this from Perforce. Salesforce is a Perforce customer, and also Perforce is a partner of ours, showing that when they lowered their releases, they did increase their velocity. They lowered their release time, increased their release frequency. We found a similar thing. This is Assembla. So at one point, we were releasing about twice a month, typical Scrum kind of thing. And then it got to be very painful. We were only releasing once a month because the system was too complicated. It really was very painful to get that release debugged. So we decided to understand and switch to this continuous delivery thing. And there's a couple of nice things about it. The nicest thing is it's a continuous process. You can see that as we did different bits of it, the releases got more and more frequent, and we're up to about 2.5 a day now, and we're seeing reasons to actually do it a lot more frequently, make these changes smaller, because it relieves a lot of stress to move things through in small changes. I had a couple of optional, here's the multi-team topologies. One big backlog coming from multiple clients, or one big backlog going out to multiple teams. That's the scalable thing, and you should be able to sort of add teams as you want and then evaluate their output with these merge requests. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation on where I think the future of cloud software development is going. I'll tell you a little about Assembla. We are a software as a service company. We make workspaces for distributed Agile teams where we provide task management and code management. And our user base and our development base is very distributed, so we live the distributed dream. And what we're doing now, the reason that we're starting to practice with presentations like this that are face-to-face instead of just hiding on the web, is because we're selling new enterprise products. We'll be coming out with those in October that handle multi-team topologies. I can show you a little bit about that. Either big projects with multiple teams working on them, or companies that have the multiple clients feeding into one backlog. And we're also, to go with that, we're offering professional services where we can help you get started with continuous delivery. We can help you with the DevOps and the continuous integration and all the other questions that you might have in doing this. We've broken it down into very achievable steps that can take you up that curve. So call me if you're interested in that.